We believe it's time to now go deeper into what we have been discussing in many situations, raised by many speakers about public engagement. So it is my pleasure to introduce to you Jerry Sheehan, Director of the Directorate for Science and Technology and Innovation in the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. So Jerry, the floor is yours.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you, Lydia, for that introduction. I'm very delighted to be able to join today's discussion. You have been discussing already in today's event, I think, one of the most fundamental challenges that is facing not just science, but modern evidence-based governance, and that's the issue of trying to strengthen trust. I think in your previous sessions today, you have already illuminated the state of trust in science, and particularly with a focus on the state of trust in Europe, and the inherent difficulties posed by a number of factors, not least of which is the accelerating pace of new scientific and technological advancements, as well as a number of other changes that we're seeing in our societies and we're seeing internationally, globally as well. I think to point out, though, that maintaining this trust in science is not merely a scientific concern. It's not just a concern for the scientific community. It's really a much broader systemic challenge that goes to the very heart of some issues around economic competitiveness, which of course are very close to the hearts of those of us at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. But it also goes to issues around maintaining social cohesion and the resilience of our democratic institutions. And as I mentioned, governance of our societies and of key public policy issues as well. The broader international context in which I operate often underscores the urgency of this discussion. And it's true across our 38 member countries, plus the European Union. All of them are grappling to different degrees and sometimes different extents with a paradigm shift around trust, some of which is brought on by new science and new technology. In particular, some of the shifts that we're seeing in the information ecosystem. We know that digital technologies, social media platforms, the same mapping I was trying to use to get over here to the library today, and increasingly other forms of artificial intelligence, right? They offer immense opportunities for greater connectivity and more effective public engagement, as well as for accelerating science and its translation into innovations. But we see, as you see here as well, that these same tools can be used both to generate and to accelerate the spread of false, misleading, and other inaccurate information that can undermine the scientific enterprise and all that it informs. We see in critical policy areas, whether those be in public health, whether it's in food security, energy security, or environmental protection, issues around rigorous science are kind of locked in a difficult battle now for public acceptance and certainly for public understanding. So what we've been saying is that this reality relates to what we refer to as a triangle of trust, if you will, which is a delicate balance and of fundamental relationships among science, the public, and the policymaking sphere. And this relationship in that triangle, among those three entities, really is the bedrock upon which we need to build trust as we aim to remain both economically competitive and economically viable with growing standards of living, while also addressing significant societal challenges and taking advantage of societal opportunities as well. We know that without a high degree of trust within this triangle, the ambitious policy goals that many of us have will falter. And we've seen this time and time again. That reminds us that this triangle of trust is really quite fragile. And there are forces that aim to weaken it or do undermine its links. So while we need effective, robust processes for translating scientific evidence into sound policy, and that's a part of our role at the OECD, is to inform that gap from science into policy making, but it's absolutely essential that we also ensure that there's direct public engagement by science and the scientific community. We like to believe politicians are responsive to their publics and vice versa. And this means, of course, that science can no longer afford to communicate what we would say is sequentially. Science has to simultaneously and strategically engage both with the political community, the policymaking community, and with the public to ensure that scientific evidence is understood, it's accepted, and maybe most importantly, that it's acted upon and put into practice. In this environment of accelerated technological change and societal transformations, we know that having shared values can be an anchor in these efforts. You have previously heard about other technological developments, AI and others, where we at OECD and other groups are also trying to develop principles for how we can advance in these technological areas in ways that are true to our shared human values, the rule of law, and to our democratic institutions. It was about a year and a half ago that we at the OECD, we gathered science and technology ministers from across our membership, and in fact, well beyond the OECD membership. I believe your previous speaker, Keiko Izumi, was one of the representatives in the room at that meeting back in April of 2024. And it's clear that this issue around common values was also a common refrain in those discussions, whether we were talking about how to use science and technology to address big societal needs and transformations, or whether it was around how we can better govern the emergence of new technologies. And it was also a cornerstone in the final declaration that came out of that meeting. It was clear that the importance of maintaining traditional values of science, meaning things around scientific freedom, autonomy in the scientific process, the openness of science, and clearly international cooperation as well. Those issues were strongly emphasized, especially given the complexities in the current geopolitical environment. One of the key outcomes of that meeting I referred to was a so-called framework for anticipatory governance of emerging technologies. And this framework, at its very basis, has the centrality of values. And looking at the values and how we incorporate those throughout the technology development process. This includes, in fact, the role of anticipation and helping us drive responsible innovation by having a greater sense of what new technologies are coming, what opportunities they offer, and what challenges they present to society that we are all going to need to work on together to try to address. And a key element in this inclusion of values in our scientific and technological development process is the role of societal engagement as clearly a way to promote trust across the diverse stakeholders who have a role in science and its translation. Among the many different pillars, then, for promoting trust in this environment is one that I think you have discussed already a bit today, which is the issue around open science. By open science, what we mean is ensuring that the results of scientific research, but in addition, the evidence on which those results were founded, as well as the process by which data were converted into analytical results and conclusions and findings. It's making sure that that is all readily and easily accessible to scientists, policymakers, and yes, to the public as well. Such openness ensures that science operates not in a black box, a closed box, but operates transparently and accessibly, which allows for scrutiny, allows for additional validation of results, which can themselves help build trust among anyone who wants to use scientific results. We find, though, too, that that openness is one component of advancing trust, but another is about how we communicate science. We at OECD and our Global Science Forum and in other venues have done work on scientific communication, and it highlights sometimes uncomfortable truth. One of which is that sometimes the scientific misinformation, the false statements that are made about science often originate from within the scientific community itself. And we witness this kind of confusion all too often, where we have high-profile scientists with unsubstantiating claims that often dominate the headlines and can distort public and political debates. And while internal academic debate is vital, it's part of the progress and the process of science, managing these kinds of contentious exchanges in the public sphere is an entirely different matter itself. And it confirms another simple but fundamental principle, which is that the rigor and the integrity of science must be the absolute foundation for building trust and maintaining trust in the public sphere and in the policy-making spheres. So again, in the work that we've done at OECD, we issued some policy guidance just last year on how communicating science responsibly can best be done. And we laid out 6 essential principles which we hope can become standard practice across scientific institutions. And let me just name those for you. The first relates back to open science, if you will. It's the issue of transparency, providing access to the underlying data. Also, as I mentioned, clearly describing methods, but crucially, communicating some of the uncertainties around our findings with honesty and with clarity. The second principle relates to inclusivity, which we mean engaging with and reaching out to all segments of society and ensuring that the communication we make is accessible to them, taking into account differences in language, differences in accessibility of different kinds of digital and other infrastructures. Third on this list is integrity. It means adhering to the highest ethical standards and ensuring intellectual honesty and actively resisting the temptation to hype scientific results. That relates to bringing in some of the issues around the uncertainties in them, but being clear and truthful and honest in how we present our results. The fourth of these principles relates to accountability, making clear who is responsible for the communication and in what capacity they are speaking, in a personal role, as an institutional representative, and ensuring that there's an open declaration of any potential conflicts of interest. Fifth, principles around freedom and autonomy. It's 5 and 5.5, I suppose. Freedom and autonomy. Communicating research without constraint from political or other external interference, and ensuring that this freedom is exercised in accordance with the previous, all 5 other principles. And then the 6th has to do with timeliness. It's delivering relevant, up-to-date information to citizens promptly, ensuring necessary quality controls, of course, but never withholding or delaying relevant scientific findings without good purpose. So these principles, while we see them as being effective for effective and responsible scientific communication, we see as fundamentally necessary for maintaining trust. It's essential and necessary, but it's not itself necessarily sufficient, because trust has to also be underpinned by shared experience and mutual respect. And this is where we can talk a bit about citizen science and other forms of engagement, because we understand, and I think we recognize increasingly, that our citizens outside the scientific community possess valuable knowledge. They've got lived experiences and unique insights that can both accelerate scientific progress, and importantly, it can dramatically improve the relevance and the uptake of scientific knowledge. This is where issues around transdisciplinary research can be oriented more toward problem solving than toward disciplinary challenges and advancement. But in particular, issues around participatory science and citizen science have to move from the periphery into the center of our research policies. We recognize that these modes of research, participatory science, citizen science, are not easily accommodated into the current science system, which still has some rather traditional conservative academic or elements to it. Working across different disciplines, working across different sectors, and meaningfully engaging the public remains challenging and is often undervalued. And in the academic circles, this work often fails to be seen, and the academic community fails to provide the necessary support, recognition, or reward for practitioners of citizen science. We have done some work at OECD and issued a report recently on embedding citizen science into research policy, and it provides something of a roadmap for systematic change that can help accommodate this type of science. I'll share with you today just 2 core recommendations for enabling this transformation. They relate to what I've been saying. The first is that the scientific community and scientific institutions have to fundamentally embrace citizen science as a valuable mode of research, recognizing that it complements and it can improve on traditional research capabilities. This is no small task. It requires nothing less than a fundamental shift in academic culture, supported by providing appropriate career pathways and systems of reward for those who practice engagement and citizen science. Second, complementary, is ensuring that the monitoring, the evaluation, and the assessment of the impacts of citizen science has to evolve. We know that traditional performance metrics that we measure science and scientific productivity and outcomes don't capture very well the full value of citizen engagement. And indeed, some of the most important important impacts often appear over the long term, and the effect of on the citizen participants themselves, which can include the direct enhancement of their trust in science, is one of the most critical outcomes that we need to think about how to better measure and then recognize and reward. So just to sum up and say in conclusion, I think we agree that trust in science is a responsibility that must be actively assumed by scientists, scientific institutions, and policymakers alike. We need to do more than simply communicate scientific findings. We also need to communicate how science functions, i.e., we need to display the rigor of science and how we support that, its underlying processes, its uncertainties, and of course, we have to better engage citizens as partners in the production and the uptake of scientific knowledge. We believe that by strengthening this public science link, we can better secure the future of evidence-based policymaking and ensure the longer-term resilience of our societies and our democracies. With that, let me close and thank you for your attention, and I look forward to joining in the panel discussion to take place now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jerry, for this very insightful speech. Without any further ado, let me call up on the stage the panelist of this session, Mohammed El Sobanit Ramadan. He's founder of SciComm AI, is co-founder of the Arab Forum of the Science, Media, and Communication. Welcome. Pampa Garcia Molina, coordinator of the Science Media Center in Spain. Thank you very much. Emily de Jong. Emily is director of France Culture. And last but not least, Hugo Mercier. He's senior researcher at the Institut Jean Nicot, CNRS, a scientific director, AI and Society Institute. Welcome to all of you. Well, it is an honor to moderate this panel. And Jerry, you alluded very well to a number of values and to a number of principles that should govern science communication. Let's perhaps deepen on that, and let's hear the views of the other panelists. Let's start with Hugo, perhaps.
Hi, thank you for the talk. So I will relate now the results of an R&R grant, so thank you for that. On the question of why people trust science. So several speakers have already pointed out that across the world there are quite high levels of trust in science, but it's not clear why so many people do trust science. And in particular, we know that it's not because they know a lot about science, because they don't. Levels of science knowledge in the adult population are very low, science literacy is very low, people don't know what the scientific method is. And so it might seem as if people are blindly trusting science, which is not ideal. And so with some colleagues, and in particular with a former PhD student, Jan Vander, we have developed a rational impression account of science, which suggests that you can actually trust science rationally even if you don't know a lot about science. Which is true for scientists as well. Like, I trust physics even though I don't understand anything about physics. And the underlying idea is that when you are exposed to science, you learn that a group of people agree on something that is really hard to know, like how life works, the age of the universe, how matter interacts. And if you see that a group of people agrees on something, it's likely that they're right, unless they're conspiring about it. And if they agree on something that's hard to know, then they have to be pretty competent. Like figuring out the age of the universe is hard. And so even if you don't understand how they do it, the very fact that these people agree with each other on something that is hard to know gives you good evidence that they are correct and that they are competent. And so you learn when you're at school, in particular, you learn a lot of impressive scientific facts, and you develop this very positive impression of scientists as being very competent. And then you forget everything. I mean, I hope I'm not the only one. So you forget most of what you've learned at school, but you maintain that positive impression of scientists. And so that's pretty much kind of the account we've developed. And I will just relate quickly a few data points and experiments we have done to show that account is quite plausible. One consequence of that account is that if you've been through school and you have had hundreds of hours of science education, you should pretty much trust science. Like, it doesn't make sense to have sat through hundreds of hours of science education and to still not trust science. So why, in most Western countries, in northern countries at least, do you have 5, 10, 15% of the population that says they don't trust science at all? Well, so we asked people, including people who say they don't trust science at all, whether they accept basic scientific knowledge. So is an electron smaller than an atom, for instance? And we tell them that indeed an electron is smaller than an atom according to established science, and here are some sources, and everybody accepts that. Essentially, people who say they don't trust science at all accept between 95 and 100% of basic science. People who believe the Earth is flat accept between 95 and 100% of basic science. So there's a bedrock of trust in science in every society that has science education that is extremely strong and robust. Another experiment we did that goes along these lines is we have provided people with impressive evidence, impressive results from scientific fields. In particular, for instance, we've done that with archaeology because people don't have very strong priors about archaeology. And so, for instance, did you know that archaeologists can now figure out how someone who has been dead for thousands of years, the age at which they had been weaned, l'âge auquel ils ont été sevrés, which is really insane. And so you give a bunch of results like this about archaeology, and lo and behold, people become more impressed by archaeologists. They think that they are more competent, they trust them more, and then 2 minutes later, they forget everything they've learned. But they maintain that impression that archaeologists are indeed a pretty competent bunch. And so we think that this kind of science can help us, guide to some extent, give some advice about science communication and what we can do, not to foster trust in science as a whole, because it's already quite high, but to foster trust in the bits of science that are maybe less trusted by the public. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, Emily, please.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for this very inspiring keynote, Jerry, which I can completely identify with as the head of a public media institution, which is France Culture. France Culture is a public radio in France that is completely based on knowledge and the transmission of knowledge, which is our DNA is completely structured around the transmission of knowledge, and of course, public engagement, which is our main value as a public media, and therefore evidence-based scientific information. Every information must be evidence-based, and that's what you brought up, which is one value that I can completely agree with. Having worked in public media for the last 30 years, I can say that the question of trust, distrust is, of course, a major issue for all of us. More specifically in France, we can say today that a recent study showed that France, but that's maybe also the French way of thinking, is that in France, trust is a subject that the French are the least trust. They're the most distrustful of most Western countries. I don't know if you've seen that study. At the same time, for example, business is considered more trustworthy than media. So how do we work on that? Me being at the head of a station that's called France Culture, and being a radio station, it's very difficult to talk about. And how do you work on public engagement and helping people and the public to build up this notion of trust in the information that is given to them? What's very interesting is even being a knowledge-based and a research-based and the open, an open air, let's say, network for researchers. Our audience ratings have gone up by 75% in the last 10 years, which is amazing by media standards, and especially radio standards at the moment, which is constantly going down. So I'm very pleased to say that research is one of our fundamental DNA. It's one of our fundamental backbones, let's say. Well, that's tautological. It's our backbone, which is basically it. And before I delve into it further, it's one of the values we all, I think, share. Voilà.
Thank you. Pampa, please.
Hola, bon après-midi. Good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me to this session about a topic, trust, science trust and public engagement, that I consider is crucial now in the current time we are living around the world, not only to guarantee the access to the culture and knowledge for everybody in the public, but for our democracies themselves. I'm sure you are familiar with the TISP study and because it has been published this year in Nature Human Behavior. And we at FECIT, that is the Spanish Foundation for Science and Technology, where I work, we are participating in this study. This is a study about trust in science and science-related populism, and the results are really interesting. It's a consortium of many institutions across all continents with 67 countries to survey more than 70,000 people about trust in science and science-related populism. That is a concept that at least I had never heard about until this year, and it's really interesting. There are there's a huge amount of data that you can consult in the results of this study, but for me, as a science journalist and as the director of the Science Media Center Spain, there are some conclusions that are especially relevant for my daily basis job. And one of them is that a large majority of the general public agree that scientists should communicate with the general public about science, and 82%. It's good news, of course. And there's another conclusion that says that trust in science have benefits for citizens. For example, societies with a high degree of trust in science cope more effectively with the COVID-19 pandemics. But there is also a risk on simplifying trust. For example, uncritical trust in science can have negative results. For example, it can make people more vulnerable to misinformation containing pseudoscientific content. And we should also take into account that we have an idea, we are still very focused on the old model of science communication, that is the deficit model, that is very well known, that says that lack of trust arises from a lack of literacy. And that's not true. That's not exactly like that. And it's a problem if we keep believing in that idea, because the results of this study show that in most countries, the association between educational level is not between educational level and trust science is not significant. There are more factors related to trust in science. For example, the trust in institutions and it in politics. The association between education and trust in scientists and in science is weaker in countries with higher levels of corruption. So we are not only talking about trust in science, we are talking about trust in the institutions that generate knowledge, that is shared knowledge. So the way we communicate science is also very important and plays a key role in building or in dismissing trust. 23% of participants in this survey think that scientists pay little or no attention to other points of view. That's, for me, that is very serious. How can people believe that scientists don't want to know about the opinions of the rest of the people? So we need avoiding top-down communication and encouraging public participation in a genuine dialogue. And finally, I would like to point out that in the times we are living, when populism movements, which tend to pit the people against the politicians, are targeting to the academics, because we have heard about that populism related to science, that says that ordinary people and common sense are better to solve our problems than academic elites and scientific knowledge that don't have so much value. In this environment, in this landscape, I think I believe in the crucial role of science journalists and communicators that have a very important role, a very important function by accompanying people in their doubts, in their skeptical opinions that are very normal, because we are asking people to be skeptical, to take care of the information they are receiving. So we should take their hands and give them a way to trust in reliable sources.
Thank you. Thank you, Pampa, for bringing these new elements about scientists and the others, the scientists and the public. Please, Mohammed, from your experience about values.
Yeah. So thank you so much for having me today. Actually, what I wanted to highlight here, or to bring something different from what we have discussing or hearing, usually when we speak about how public engagement would or should strengthen that trust in science. Based on my experience as someone originally from Egypt, so I am born and raised in the so-called global south. And what I could see is that when we speak about that, how we strengthen or promote trust in science through public engagement, we have some assumptions. The first assumption is that there is a kind of a democratic ecosystem to some extent, which unfortunately doesn't exist everywhere. And we even can claim that we are witnessing the eroding in many of the established democracies, declining of democracy maybe. Yes, that's one question. So how public engagement could or couldn't work in this kind of atmosphere, we need to think about this more. The second assumption is, when we speak about trust in science, what do we mean exactly by science here? Science here is usually perceived as a kind of the modern science, natural sciences, scientific methodology, science as a process, as an institution, shaped mainly by Western perspective, and in the same time by how the word science is framed in English language. Because people in other places around the world are perceiving science in different way. So for example, science in Arabic means ilm, and the root of this word means to know, which is something different. And when you refer to science in the Arab world, for example, it can include natural sciences, it can also include religious sciences, but it will not include social sciences because we call it social studies. So how science is perceived is completely different. Think of Europe also like how the word science is translated into different languages. This is another thing. What do we mean exactly by trust of science? The third assumption is that we can quantify or evaluate or assess the public trust in science, because again, that doesn't happen anywhere. Actually, the study Pampa has referred to is, as far as I know, one of the very few or even the earliest studies that try to quantify public trust in science in many countries in the Arab world, including my home country, Egypt. And I was surprised by the result of this study because it claimed that actually when you see the rankings, Egypt ranked as the nation with the most respondents, were 100% of respondents, say that they are trust in science. And honestly, I was surprised by that. So I went back to see the methodology of the study. And they said, okay, we translate this questionnaire in Arabic and send this to this kind of sample. And when I look on how it was phrased in Arabic, actually the way the question was phrased will make everyone answer, yes, I trust in science. That's why we ended up having 100% of people trusting in science. So, in a world where we don't have these three assumptions, democracy is underdeveloped or there even lack of democracy, science is perceived in a different way, and also we cannot quantify trust in science. How public engagement should work in that? That's what I'm trying to, I cannot claim that I have an answer to that. I have been working in a kind of ecosystem where we lack the three of them. what I can share from this is at a certain moment, because also there's a kind of, I mean, the triangle you have referred to, like this kind of, okay, scientific community, the public, and the policymakers, actually, I mean, for us, is a kind of doesn't exist, more or less, because, I mean, we are trying to do science communication, public engagement, just to build the bridge between the scientific community and the public. But how this is going to influence policy making, to making it like more kind of evidence-based or make like science-based policies, it's not clear. So the only way for us, because like we cannot work on the top-down level, we can only work through the bottom-up level. So we go grassroots, we try to see how people understand and perceive science, to collaborate together and move from there.
Thank you. Thank you very much, all of you, for bringing all these elements in a very nice perspective, because I think from the difference from the panelists this morning is that you are here mostly science communicators, experts. And that is very, journalists, even journalists, no? So that's a super interesting perspective for us to bring in this platform, because here we are talking about, this is a conference organized by national research funding organizations and research performing organizations. So the intended outcomes would be recommendations for them. How can they take some actions at the institutional level to improve communication, to improve trust in science, but also, as you have raised, Jerry and Kay and other speakers this morning, how to talk to politicians. Because these organizations are often at the interface, at the interplay of political moves and also communicating science to citizens. So we found very interesting when putting this session together to explore how scientists work with scientific journalists or with communication journalists. And we want to analyze, if you can tell from your experience, how healthy is the relationship, how can be improved, what can be done to work better together, to face all these problems that you are reporting here about engagement, this triangle. I thought it was very practical, the triangle you put us about public, science, politicians. So what can we do, in your view, from your perspectives, to improve dialogue between scientists and journalists? Now, then we'll talk at other questions. Who would you like to start? Hugo?
Thank you. I mean, to some extent, I think that from the very beginning of science journalism and science popularization, people who publicize science have been onto something, in the sense that they naturally stress the more impressive results, the things that are kind of flashy. And actually, it might be one of the things that is actually driving the way the public reacts to science. So maybe journalists can teach, more, scientists something about what are the interesting things to communicate. I guess where the communication goes both ways is that the scientists are there to ensure that, okay, flashy results are great, but they have to be consensual. I mean, many scientists discover things that are really just amazing. But before you communicate them to the public, you have to make sure that they are solidly established. Otherwise, you risk having some backlash. So it's good, the journalists, the drive to talk about really flashy results is actually not bad, but you have to make sure that they're really solid before you talk about them.
Maybe I can add, I'd like to get back to what you referred to in your keynote, which is the importance of transparency and communicating the methods, and which is something that is absolutely essential, and which we have observed within France Culture how important it is. And recently, in this season, in the current season, we created a new strand, which is called Chantier de la Recherche, the research in progress, we could say, which is every day we have researchers that come and speak about the type of where they are at their research, which includes the transparency on the state of where they are, the questions they're asking themselves, how they're going about their methods, and where the uncertainties are, for example. Our objective here is to engage with the public, of course, but also to engage to create a scientific community that in itself can recognize itself within what the researchers are saying. So we find it extremely important to not only have scientific journalists that can speak with the scientific community, which we have specific shows in the afternoon. We have an hour show every day about science. We have science chroniclers. Those are journalists who speak with scientific community. But we find it's extremely important to show the importance of the scientific community itself. And that's what we're trying to do with this strand that we put it every day. So it's a daily show. It's 10 minutes long, and it gives all types of all scientific disciplines, not only hard science, but sociology, economics, everything that has to do with research, a speaking platform that can be shared with the open public and with our journalists. And we find it very important to talk about the method and transparency.
Excellent point. Please, Pampa.
Yes, this is my job, in fact, engaging scientists to talk to the media and also improving the way the media talks to scientists. This is the role of the science media centers, not only in Spain but in other countries around the world. So for me, there's something that is a key point in the relationship between the media and the scientists. Respect, first of all. Scientists are specialists in science, and journalists are specialists in journalism, in communication, and in engaging the public with the news. And a second point that I consider very important is that many times we listen to scientists that complain about the lack of participation of scientists in the public debate. And of course, it's true. Many times we are watching TV and we watch that kind of programs where there is an opinologist, you say that in another language, that is giving opinions on everything about science, volcanoes and medical emergencies and vaccines and I don't know, whatever. That is the opinologist about science. Yes, I agree with scientists that they should have a more important role in the media. But if they want to do that, and I think that we all want it to happen, they have to talk to the people, to the general public. They don't have to write a paper every time they are talking about a science topic. And talking to the people is very important, and with a language that everybody can understand, without feeling fear to be like less respected by the academia. We need scientists engaged to the public, to go to the ground and talk in a language that everybody can understand. And I think that people are wishing seeing that participation.
So when we started the Arab Forum of Science, Media and Communication in 2021, it was like in the middle of like COVID pandemic, where suddenly everyone realized that science is important, and also science communicators and science journalists are very important. So the Arab Forum of Science, Media and Communication is a kind of a platform for networking and capacity building in this field. So I remember like our first conference, we brought like scientists and like media professionals and journalists and communicators, PR people in research institutions together, and suddenly we discovered that there is actually a mistrust issue between the scientists or the scientific community and the media, because scientists are afraid to speak to the media because either they were like kind of misquoted or misrepresented before, or know someone who has been misquoted or misrepresented before. And we find that the first thing we need to address this kind of gap, this kind of mistrust issue here. And the only way we do it is kind of mutual learning and mutual understanding, because scientists are coming from a world and media are completely different world, and they don't understand each other. They work in different dynamics. They need to understand that. And in most cases, at least in the Arab world, that science journalists not necessarily are specialized or trained to be a science journalist. They are journalists who have happened to be covering science. So after this kind of discussions trying to work on the mistrust issue, we decided to go further with capacity building of both. So whenever we have a capacity building program to train people or journalists to be science journalists, we bring scientists also to make sure that they are in the room and they hear each other, they understand each other. And also to focus that, yes, while addressing this gap between them, that both of them should be working together to inform the public. That's the rule. They have to keep the public in their mind. So, and this is requires a lot of work to shift the focus of scientific reporting from reporting findings to reporting the process of science, exactly how it works, uncertainty in science, to just avoid this mistrust issue with also the public.
Yeah, thank you. I think maybe another point to make, I mean, we think about scientists do communicate a lot, but they tend to communicate to other scientists. Right. I mean, look at the number of scientific publications, scientific conferences, and I think they're quite skilled in doing that. And maybe there are a few who can be quite good at communicating to the public. So I think just to build on what you were saying, I think that looking at the relationship between the communications in the media sector and the scientific community, it's very symbiotic, or should be a much more symbiotic relationship. One way of thinking about it too, though, is using some of what the media and the communicators are seeing as the issues of the time on which science can inform, and using that then to drive some of the communication with scientists can be important, right? Because I'm sure within many of the scientific research institutions, there are public communication offices or press communication offices. We have a new finding, a new publication, and here's what it is. And that's one way of getting the word out, and again, with great assistance from public communicators. But there's also an importance of making sure that we operate in the opposite direction, if you will. Here's an issue that is current today in which people are debating, right? There's a lot of discussion going on in France right now and in many other countries, right, about how to better protect children online. Whether you did a research study on that just came out last week, or you did something that's a few months old or even last year, there's a wealth of information that scientists can pull together and communicate on that kind of issue. And I think ensuring that there is then that two-way dialogue of kind of probing the scientific community as well as pushing the science out into the public is incredibly important. When we look back at some of the examples we saw even during the pandemic or during other instances of time where there was quite an interest in science. We did see where there were institutions that were doing, I think Japan was quite good at this, doing more informal briefing sessions, bringing together, scientists with the press. We've seen examples, I think in Norway, there are cases of, more scientific debates that were televised, right? That also demonstrated, comes back to this issue of, right, demonstrating that, yes, here's what we know in science, but here are the uncertainties. And here are two scientists who are debating the points, both bringing evidence to the table. But I think that's a way of also giving the public a better appreciation for what science is. It's not just what you read in your textbook or you find online now, right? It is a process. There is evidence that moves us ahead in our understanding, but there is still room for debate and for interpretation. But to see that play out, if you will, in real time through those kinds of engagements is incredibly important. And maybe the one, I referenced this in my remarks, the one thing I think both from the scientific side and from the media side to be careful about is the question of hype and overhyping. And of course, scientists want to see, big attention to the work that they've done. Media also looking for audiences and so forth. But to being sure to temper that, here is what has been found, or here's what we think has been found, but it comes back to communicating some uncertainties around that and trying to ensure that, coming back to these issues of sort of integrity and truthfulness in science, that we are communicating kind of the full story and not just what might capture the public attention for the moment.
Yes, thank you. Great, great insights. Let me turn to the public. In the last few minutes, we are going to delay the end because we delayed the start. May I ask to the public to perhaps raise their hands? We are ready to take a few questions. Also, we know that there are people online, so if there are any questions from the participants online, by all means, our colleague who is monitoring them, if she can take the microphone for the moment. One question here in the middle, please.
Thank you.
Please identify yourself first.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Daniela Ovadia from the Center for Ethics in Science and Journalism. I'm a professor of ethics of research and also a science journalist. I have a question for the audience because I keep on hearing and mixing two different terms, which is science communicator and science journalist. And I think this is a huge mistake we keep on doing, also in the light of trust in science. These are two different professions and two different roles in the ecosystem of building trust. I'm analyzing the use of the term in European documents from the Commission, and there is really a blurry definition. It's used, I mean, every time even you use the science communicators to refer to journalists, you do not expect a facilitator in politics or someone who organizes a museum area on politics to cover politics. You think those are two different areas and two different democratic roles, but you expect science journalists to be part of the explanatory part of science, which is part of their role, but not the core of their role. So my question for you is, what can we do as journalists or even scholars in journalism to convince the institutions that these are two different roles that have to be supported differently and has to be addressed differently?
Let me collect two more questions and then you reply to all
Bonjour.
questions.
Sorry, good morning, good afternoon. Catherine Baudopéan, I'm former expert for DG Connect and actually editor in Frontiers. I would like to maybe open up the panel, for evaluating how far peer review can be maybe a bridge between citizens and scientists. Thanks.
Thank you. There was one question here, please.
My name is Laetitia Sifer and I work at the World Health Organization in the Office of the Chief Scientist, and I wanted to ask the panel about potential ideas and suggestions for measuring trust. I think we see that trust is a fabric of the social fabric, and so it can be broken in many different ways. The trust in the science, in scientists, the trust in institutions. And so I wanted to ask the panel if they could reflect on some methodologies they have used, some metrics. I think you have brought the issues of a survey, for example, that also has some bias, and also thinking if we want to make the investment case for trust to policymakers, it would be good that we have also some metrics and that can also support that evidence. So really interested in your own projects and fields if you have found some metrics and methodologies that can help us in that regard. Thank you.
Thank you. These are quite complex questions for a few minutes responses, but maybe you can address one or two briefly, each one of you. So we have the science communication, science journalist professions, so the differentiation within the sector, question on the peer review, and systems of measuring trust, I think. So first for you. Okay, Pampa, jump in.
Hi. This works? Just speak. Hi, yes. I love your question. And last week, I was in the World Conference of Science Journalists in Pretoria, South Africa, and we were talking about this question that you have in a panel where I participated. It is very strange because why should a science communicator be defined as a science journalist? Why is there that problem? In fact, I don't understand that. I think it's very related to the crisis on the editorial model in the media. There are not journalists in the media. So we have a very strange situation. Many journalists are working in institutions and they are communicators, they are press officers, because there are not more positions for journalists in the media. That's so simple. There are many news that are written by automatical bots, and that's the information that we are receiving. So there is a real crisis in the editorial staff, and so people prefer working in institutions as science communicators, and I understand that. That's logical, because you should have a job and earn some money to pay the bills and have some stability in your life. But I think there is a problem with the prestige of the journalism between people who have studied journalism in their university years. So they like to be called journalists, even if they are working for an institution. The main difference between a science journalist and a science communicator is that science journalist is working for the public, and a science communicator is working for their institution. It doesn't mean that they are not telling the truth or that they have gone to the dark side, but there is a perception about it that for me it's very pernicious.
Yes, thank you, Daniela, for bringing that question, because I think it's very important to highlight this, because like in some context or some parts of the world, actually, like, science journalists see themselves as science communicators, and in some cases even like there is no kind of real differentiation between them. I used to work in Egypt as science communicator and science journalist in the same time, because that's the only way that I can earn a living. I mean, I had no choice. And also, you cannot also disassociate the relationship between the status of journalism and the media and the freedom of speech in a certain country and the status of science journalism. So when you don't have a real journalism with real journalistic values, of course, then the job of science journalists will tend to be science communicator. How, in an ideal world, how we can like make this differentiation between both? I think science journalists have to stand up for themselves, especially when we are seeing the eroding role of journalism with AI, with like this new model of journalist/content creator or journalist/media influencer or science influencer or whatever. I mean, where is journalism going exactly? I mean, I tend to be working less as a science journalist because I see the way we are going is not definitely the right direction. I don't have an answer to that, but at least we have to acknowledge we need to do something about it.
Good. May I ask also to address all the questions?
Just to add another angle to the question, and thank you for this question, which is very interesting. At France Culture, we have one value, which is transparency, which I already mentioned, but also mediation. And we have two forms of journalism. Then our journalists, or our producers who are animators on our channel, they are either scientific journalists or mediators. But we find that the most important is that every subject is based on a researcher, scientists witnessing. And so we go to the source. And that's one thing that's so wonderful about public media, is the fact that we want to work on integrity and at least to have the public be able to hear the source itself. And the journalist or the person who does the mediation is there to develop transparency and exchange and public engagement. So what I think having the scientists, hearing the scientists themselves is what's extremely important.
Thank you. Maybe you want to go?
I'll weigh in on that question, but then I'll shift to another one as well, which I think
Okay.
you wanted us to try to do too. So just maybe on the communication question, I mean, I think very valid to recognize there are many different roles in communicating science, even to different audiences, whether it's the public, whether it's to policymakers and others. And I think that, I mean, one, very helpful to kind of sort out what the different roles are. But secondly, to ensure that issues of like codes of conduct and so forth like are developed for each of these roles. So whether it's, there are codes of conduct in the scientific community that maybe need to be re-examined to ensure that they cover the extent to which scientists more broadly communicate their findings in addition to, quote, publishing their findings, but also roles for, for those who are involved in communication roles between the scientists, whether it's in policymakers or in the public, and ensuring that they also have a code of conduct for ensuring the integrity and the communication of the science. And honestly, that could be extended to many others who use science or should be using science in especially, I'll say, policy decision-making, but any public decision-making that is informed by science, right, to ensure that it's taken into account. So I think, again, mapping that out and ensuring that there are expectations and criteria and relevant training provided to people in all of those different roles is important. If I can, let me just come back quickly to the question about measuring trust, because I think we've seen a number of different surveys, some long-standing surveys on public perceptions of science, scientists, scientific institutions, and that gives us a nice longitudinal base for looking over time. I mean, within the OECD, doing this kind of measurement is kind of the core of so much of our work. We have been doing work that looks at currently two different areas. One is about trust in governments and public institutions and some of the factors underlying that. And we've also done some work more recently looking at the ability of the public to essentially to understand truth from mistruths and differentiate between those, I'll say, in the media. Using kind of gamified surveys of different topics. What these have allowed us to do is come up with data that are also, to the extent that they can be translated appropriately into other languages, but that's been the intent, is to give us comparable data across countries. And you can see some of this now published. I'm happy to provide you links, which give you a sense of how trust and the ability to detect true versus false content varies across populations in different countries, as well as some of the subpopulation breakdowns, right, between young people who we need to be really concerned about, right, as their habits are still developing, and among, older people and those in different levels of education and so forth. So from our perspectives, gives insight into where different types of targeted policy measures may be helpful in addressing some of the shortcomings.
Thank you. Hugo, last words for you.
Big responsibility to keep answering the same question about trust in science more specifically. As you started saying, people have developed a number of scales and measures of trust in science. And on the whole, it seems that people mostly trust scientists as being competent. And then if you look at other metrics, such as how much they care about society, how much integrity they have, scores drop a little bit, in particular for how much scientists tend to be perceived as kind of cold and less, maybe agreeable than they are competent. But even if people seem to distinguish between these different dimensions, the scores tend to correlate between individuals. So someone who tends to believe that scientists are very competent is also more likely to believe that they are, maybe more likely to have society's interest at heart than someone else. So you have these dimensions, but the variations seem to kind of travel together.
Thank you. I think there's some questions still to respond. Any last words? No, we leave it here because we are already late with the program. I'm sorry. Please join me in thanking the panelists of these sessions with a big round of applause. And thank you.